The Louisiana sky had been threatening all day, heavy clouds rolling in from the Gulf like dark omens. By evening, the first drops began to fall on the sprawling Belle Reve plantation, each one carrying the promise of a violent storm to come. Master Theodore Beaumont stood on the wraparound porch of his grand white mansion, watching the rain begin to pelt the cypress trees that lined his property. At 52, he was a man hardened by years of managing what he considered his empire. 300 acres of cotton fields worked by nearly 60 enslaved souls. His cold grey eyes surveyed the quarters where his property lived, calculating losses and gains like a merchant counting coins. "Nora!" His voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack. The old woman emerged slowly from the kitchen house, her weathered hands still damp from washing the dinner dishes. At 73, Nora had spent more than 5 decades on Belle Reve, arriving as a young woman of 20 and watching generations of enslaved families come and go. Her back was permanently bent from years of labor, and her once strong hands now trembled with age and arthritis. "Yes, Master Beaumont," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the increasing rain. Beaumont's face twisted with disgust as he looked at her. "Look at you. Can barely hold a plate without shaking. Yesterday you dropped my good china, and today I watched you struggle to carry a single bucket of water." Nora kept her eyes downcast, knowing that meeting his gaze would only fuel his anger. "I'm sorry, Master. I'll be more careful." "Careful?" Beaumont stepped closer, his boots echoing on the wooden porch. "You're useless, old woman. I feed you, house you, and what do I get in return? Broken dishes and spilled water. You're costing me more than you're worth." The rain was falling harder now, creating a steady drumbeat on the tin roof of the kitchen house. In the distance, lightning flickered across the darkening sky, followed by the low rumble of thunder. "Please, Master," Nora whispered, her voice trembling. "I can still work. I can tend the garden, help with the cooking." "Enough!" Beaumont's hand struck her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed even over the rain. Nora stumbled backward, her hand instinctively rising to her face. "I'm done wasting resources on dead weight. Get off my property now." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. In all her years at Belle Reve, she had never imagined this moment would come. Where could a 73-year-old enslaved woman go in the middle of a Louisiana storm? "Master, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I have nowhere to go. The storm, that's not my problem anymore." Beaumont turned his back on her, already dismissing her from his thoughts. "You have 10 minutes to gather whatever rags you call belongings and get out. If I see you on my land after that, I'll set the dogs on you." As if summoned by his words, 2 large hunting dogs appeared at his side, their eyes fixed on Nora with predatory interest. She had seen what those dogs could do to runaway slaves who were brought back to the plantation. With shaking hands, Nora gathered the few possessions she could call her own. A worn shawl that had belonged to her mother, a small wooden cross carved by her late husband, and the tattered dress she wore. The rain soaked through her thin clothing within seconds of stepping off the porch. From the windows of the slave quarters, dozens of eyes watched in horror as the old woman stumbled into the storm. Elias, a 28-year-old field hand with broad shoulders and intelligent eyes, pressed his face against the small window of his cabin. His hands clenched into fists as he watched Nora disappear into the darkness. "We can't just let her die out there," whispered Sarah, a young woman who had worked alongside Nora in the kitchen house. Her voice was barely audible over the storm, but the anguish in it was unmistakable. "What choice do we have?" replied Marcus, an older man whose spirit had been broken by decades of brutality. "You know what happens to slaves who disobey direct orders." But Elias was already moving, his mind racing with possibilities. He had been planning his own escape for months, studying the patterns of the overseers and the layout of the surrounding swampland. He knew every inch of Belle Reve's property, including the old structures that dotted the landscape, remnants of the plantation's earlier days. "There's an old tobacco barn about a quarter-mile north of here," he said quietly to the small group gathered around him. "Been abandoned for years if she can make it that far." Lightning illuminated the quarters for a brief moment, revealing the faces of men and women torn between fear and compassion. They all knew the risks of defying Master Beaumont, but they also knew that Nora had been like a grandmother to many of them, offering comfort and wisdom during their darkest moments. "I'm going after her," Elias declared, his voice steady despite the danger he was courting. "Elias, no," Sarah grabbed his arm. "If they catch you, if we do nothing, she'll die out there tonight." His eyes met each of theirs in turn. "I can't live with that on my conscience." The storm was reaching its full fury now, with wind howling through the trees and rain falling in sheets so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Somewhere in that chaos, an old woman was struggling to survive, abandoned by the only world she had ever known. As Elias prepared to venture into the storm, none of them could have imagined what they would find in that abandoned barn, or how one act of compassion in the darkness would set in motion events that would change Belle Reve forever. The thunder crashed overhead like the sound of a world breaking apart, and in many ways it was. Nora's bare feet slipped in the mud as she stumbled through the cotton fields, her thin dress clinging to her frail body like a second skin. The rain was merciless, driving into her face with such force that she could barely keep her eyes open. Each step was agony, her arthritic joints screaming in protest, her lungs burning as she fought to breathe through the wall of water falling from the sky. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes since Master Beaumont had cast her out. The familiar landmarks of Belle Reve were invisible in the storm, and she found herself disoriented, unsure if she was even heading away from the plantation or walking in circles. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape for a brief, terrifying moment. In that flash, Nora saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The dark silhouette of a structure rising from the field ahead. The old tobacco barn that had been abandoned years ago when Master Beaumont shifted the plantation's focus entirely to cotton. Summoning strength she didn't know she still possessed, Nora pushed forward through the mud and debris. The barn's roof was partially collapsed, and the walls were weathered and full of gaps, but it was shelter, the first real protection she had found since being cast out into the storm. She reached the barn just as another lightning strike illuminated the sky, and in that moment of brightness, she saw something that made her freeze in terror. Huddled in the far corner of the barn, pressed against the wall like a cornered animal, was a small figure. A boy no more than 12 years old, his dark skin glistening with rain and sweat. For a moment, neither moved. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, clearly expecting Nora to raise an alarm or flee back into the storm. But as Nora's vision adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that broke her heart. The boy was injured, a deep gash across his forehead still bleeding, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "Child," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "What are you doing here?" The boy pressed himself further against the wall, his good hand clutching what appeared to be a small bundle of belongings. "Please don't tell them where I am," he whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion and pain. "Please." Nora's heart clenched as she recognized the desperation in his voice, the same desperation she had felt countless times over the decades. This was a runaway, probably from one of the neighboring plantations, seeking shelter from both the storm and the slave catchers who would be hunting him. "I won't tell anyone, child," she said softly, moving slowly toward him so as not to frighten him further. "What's your name?" "Samuel," he whispered. "Samuel from Riverside Plantation." Nora knew Riverside, a smaller plantation about 10 miles east of Belle Reve, owned by a man whose cruelty was legendary, even among the brutal plantation owners of Louisiana. If this boy had run from there, he had good reason. "How long have you been running, Samuel?" 3 days, he replied, his voice growing weaker. "Been hiding during the day, moving at night. But the storm..." I couldn't go any further. Nora could see that the boy was in bad shape. Besides his obvious injuries, he was shivering uncontrollably, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Without immediate care, he might not survive the night. Without hesitation, Nora removed her worn shawl, the only thing providing her any warmth, and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. "Here, child, this will help." "But you'll be cold," Samuel protested weakly. "I've been cold before," Nora replied, settling down beside him. "Right now you need this more than I do." As she arranged the shawl around him, Nora felt the boy's forehead. He was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch, despite his violent shivering. She knew the signs. Infection was setting in from his wounds, and without proper treatment it would kill him. "Samuel, I need to look at your arm," she said gently. The boy nodded weakly, too exhausted to resist. As carefully as she could, Nora examined his injured limb. It was definitely broken, probably from a fall during his escape. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, which was fortunate, but it needed to be set properly. "This is going to hurt, child, but I need to straighten your arm," she explained. "Can you be brave for me?" Samuel nodded, biting down on his lower lip to prepare for the pain. Nora had helped deliver babies and tended to injuries in the slave quarters for decades. It was knowledge passed down from the older women who had come before her. With practiced hands, she carefully manipulated the broken bone back into alignment. Samuel's scream was muffled by the thunder, but Nora felt his body go rigid with pain before he mercifully lost consciousness. Using strips torn from her own dress, she fashioned a crude splint from pieces of wood she found in the barn. As she worked, the storm continued to rage outside. But inside the barn, something remarkable was happening. Despite being cast out by the only world she had ever known, despite facing her own death in the storm, Nora had found purpose again. This boy needed her, and that need gave her strength she thought she had lost forever. She held Samuel close, sharing what little body heat she had, whispering soft words of comfort as he drifted in and out of consciousness. The rain continued to pour through the gaps in the roof, but Nora positioned herself to shield the boy from the worst of it, letting the cold water soak her own body while keeping him as dry as possible. Meanwhile, back at Belle Reve, Elias was making his final preparations. He had waited until the overseers had taken shelter from the storm, knowing that their patrols would be suspended until the weather cleared. In the chaos of the storm, he might be able to reach Nora and bring her back without being detected. He slipped out of his cabin and into the storm, immediately understanding why Master Beaumont had been so confident that Nora wouldn't survive the night. The wind was strong enough to knock a man down, and the rain was so heavy it was like trying to breathe underwater. But Elias pressed on, guided by his knowledge of the plantation's layout and his determination to save the woman who had been a source of comfort to so many of them over the years. He had no way of knowing that his search would lead him to something far more significant than a rescue. It would lead him to a moment that would change everything. As lightning continued to illuminate the Louisiana landscape, two separate acts of courage were unfolding in the darkness. One in a slave cabin, where a young man risked everything to save an old woman, and another in an abandoned barn where that same old woman was risking her life to save a child she had never met before. The storm was far from over, and neither was the night that would transform Belle Reve forever. Elias fought his way through the storm, his powerful frame bent against the wind as he navigated the familiar paths of Belle Reve by memory alone. The rain had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, and more than once he found himself knee-deep in water that had never been there before. The storm was unlike anything he had experienced in his 28 years, a true Louisiana tempest that seemed determined to wash away everything in its path. Behind him, three other figures struggled through the darkness. Despite the danger, Sarah had insisted on joining the search, along with Marcus and a young field hand named David. They had waited until they were certain the overseers had taken shelter, then slipped out of their quarters one by one, meeting at the edge of the cotton fields. "Can't see nothing in this rain," David shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible, even though he was only a few feet away. "Stay close," Elias called back. "The old tobacco barn should be just ahead." They had been searching for over an hour, checking every possible shelter they could think of. The old smokehouse had been empty, as had the abandoned overseer's cabin near the north field. With each empty building, their hope diminished and their fear grew. An elderly woman couldn't survive long in conditions like these. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment the landscape was illuminated in stark black and white. In that brief moment of visibility, Elias saw it, the dark outline of the tobacco barn, its partially collapsed roof making it look like a wounded animal crouched in the field. "There!" he shouted, pointing toward the structure. They ran the final 100 yards, slipping and sliding in the mud, driven by desperation and the fading hope that they weren't too late. As they approached the barn, Elias could see that one wall had partially collapsed, leaving a gap large enough for a person to enter. "Nora!" Sarah called out as they reached the barn. "Nora, are you in there?" For a moment there was no response except the sound of rain drumming on the remaining portions of the roof. Then from inside the barn came a weak voice. "Here, I'm here." Elias squeezed through the gap in the wall first, followed by the others. In the darkness of the barn, it took a moment for their eyes to adjust. When they did, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. Nora was sitting against the far wall, but she wasn't alone. Wrapped in her shawl and cradled in her arms was a young boy, his face pale and drawn with fever. The old woman's dress was soaked through, and she was shivering violently, but her arms remained steady around the child. "Dear Lord," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees beside them. "Nora, what? Who is this?" "His name is Samuel," Nora said, her voice weak but determined. "He's hurt bad. Been running for 3 days." Elias understood immediately. This was a runaway slave, probably from one of the neighboring plantations. If they were caught helping him, the consequences would be severe, possibly fatal. But as he looked at the boy's injured face and Nora's protective embrace, he knew there was no choice to be made. "How bad is he hurt?" Marcus asked, kneeling down to examine the boy. "Broken arm, fever from infection," Nora replied. "He needs proper care, or he won't make it through the night." The 4 rescuers exchanged glances in the darkness. They had come to save Nora, but now they faced a much more complicated situation. Helping a runaway slave was one of the most serious crimes an enslaved person could commit. It was considered theft of another man's property and rebellion against the entire system. "We can't take him back to the quarters," David said quietly, "if the overseers find him. And we can't leave him here to die," Sarah added firmly. Elias was thinking rapidly, weighing their options. The storm provided cover, but it also made movement dangerous and difficult. They needed shelter, medical supplies, and time, none of which were readily available. "There's an old root cellar about half a mile from here," he said finally. "Used to store vegetables before they built the new one closer to the big house. It's underground, dry, and nobody's been there in years." "Can we move them both that far?" Marcus asked, looking at Nora's weakened condition. "We have to try," Elias replied. "Staying here isn't an option. When this storm clears, they'll be searching every building on the plantation." Nora struggled to stand, still clutching Samuel protectively. "I can walk," she said, though her legs were clearly unsteady. "No," Sarah said firmly, moving to support her. "We'll help you." Elias carefully lifted Samuel, surprised by how light the boy was. Malnutrition and days of running had taken their toll. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake, lost in the fevered dreams that had claimed him. "Marcus, you and David scout ahead," Elias instructed. "Make sure the path is clear. Sarah, help Nora. I'll carry the boy." They made their way out of the barn and back into the storm, moving slowly and carefully through the darkness. The root cellar was located in a depression near the edge of the plantation, hidden by overgrown vegetation and largely forgotten by everyone except the oldest slaves who remembered when it was still in use. The journey that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to nearly an hour as they navigated fallen branches, flooded areas, and the treacherous footing created by the storm. Nora stumbled several times, her strength nearly gone, but Sarah and Marcus took turns supporting her, refusing to let her fall. When they finally reached the root cellar, Elias felt a surge of relief. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen leaves and debris, and the heavy wooden door was still intact. Marcus pulled it open, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. "It's dry," David reported, having descended to check the interior. "Smells musty, but it's solid." They helped Nora down the steps first. Then Elias carefully carried Samuel into the underground chamber. The cellar was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, but it was completely dry and surprisingly warm, insulated by the earth around it. Sarah had managed to bring a small oil lamp from the quarters, and by its flickering light they could see that the cellar was in better condition than expected. Stone walls, a dirt floor, and wooden shelves that had once held vegetables now stood empty but intact. "This will work," Elias said, settling Samuel on a makeshift bed of their combined outer garments. "At least until the storm passes." Nora collapsed onto the floor beside the boy, her strength finally giving out completely. Sarah immediately began checking her for injuries, alarmed by how cold and pale she had become. "She's in shock," Sarah said quietly. "Exposure, exhaustion. She needs warmth and rest, and the boy needs medicine for that fever," Marcus added, feeling Samuel's burning forehead. They were safe for the moment, hidden away in their underground refuge while the storm raged above. But Elias knew their problems were just beginning. They now had a critically ill runaway slave and an elderly woman who had been cast out by their master. When morning came, difficult decisions would have to be made. As if reading his thoughts, Nora spoke from where she lay beside Samuel. "Thank you," she whispered, "all of you. for coming for me." "We couldn't leave you out there," Sarah replied, taking the old woman's hand. "And we won't leave him either," Elias added, looking down at Samuel's pale face. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Louisiana, but inside the root cellar, something precious was taking root, a bond forged by compassion and courage that would prove stronger than the forces trying to destroy it. The night was far from over, and the real test of their resolve was yet to come. The storm had finally begun to subside as the first grey light of dawn crept across Belle Reve Plantation. In the root cellar, the small group had maintained their vigil through the night, taking turns watching over Samuel while Nora drifted in and out of exhausted sleep. Elias sat near the cellar entrance, listening to the sounds above. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, and the rain had softened from a torrential downpour to a steady drizzle. Soon the overseers would emerge from their shelters and begin assessing the storm damage, and that meant their hiding place would no longer be safe. Samuel's fever had broken sometime during the night, and though he was still weak, his breathing had become more regular. Nora had insisted on staying beside him despite her own exhaustion, occasionally murmuring words of comfort when he stirred restlessly. "We need to move soon," Marcus whispered, checking the boys' makeshift splint. "Once they start the damage assessment, they'll be everywhere." Sarah had been thinking about their situation all night. "Where can we take them? Samuel can't go back to Riverside. They'll kill him for running, and Master Beaumont made it clear Nora isn't welcome here anymore." "There might be a way," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "My cousin works at the Dubois plantation about 15 miles north. Says Master Dubois is different, treats his slaves better than most." "Maybe that's a big maybe," David interjected. "And even if this Dubois would take them, how do we get them there without being caught?" Before Elias could answer, they heard voices above, distant but growing closer. The search had begun. "Everyone stay quiet," Elias whispered, moving to the cellar door to listen. Through the wooden planks they could hear the voices of the overseers as they began their inspection of the plantation grounds. The voices were still far away, but they were methodical, checking every structure for storm damage. "Found some shingles blown off the main house," one voice called out. "Tobacco barns got more damage," another replied. "Whole walls come down." Elias felt his heart skip. If they were checking the tobacco barn, it was only a matter of time before they expanded their search to other abandoned structures. Samuel stirred, his eyes opening for the first time since the night before. Where am I?" he whispered. "Safe," Nora said softly, placing a gentle hand on his forehead. "You're safe, child." The boy's eyes focused on the unfamiliar faces around him, and for a moment fear flickered across his features, but something in Nora's expression seemed to calm him. "The storm," he said, memory returning. "You helped me." "We all helped," Nora replied. "These good people came looking for us." Samuel tried to sit up, wincing as the movement jarred his broken arm. "I have to keep moving. If they catch me—" "You're not going anywhere in your condition," Sarah said firmly. "That arm needs time to heal and you're still weak from fever." "But if they find me here, they'll punish all of you," Samuel protested, his young voice heavy with the weight of understanding what his presence meant for his rescuers. Elias moved away from the door and knelt beside the boy. "That's our choice to make, not yours. Right now, we need to focus on getting you and Nora somewhere safe." The voices above were getting closer now, and they could hear the sound of debris being moved as the overseers cleared fallen branches and assessed damage to various structures. "There's something else," Nora said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Something I haven't told you." All eyes turned to her, waiting. "Samuel isn't just running from Riverside," she continued. "He's trying to reach his sister. She was sold to a plantation in Mississippi last month. He's been planning this for weeks." The revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. This wasn't just a desperate flight from cruelty. It was a family trying to reunite, a bond that slavery had tried to break but couldn't destroy. "How do you know this?" Marcus asked. "He told me during the night when the fever was making him talk," Nora explained. "His sister's name is Ruth. She's only 14. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. She had a younger sister herself, sold away 3 years ago to a plantation in Alabama. The pain of that separation was still fresh, and she understood exactly what drove Samuel to risk everything. Then we help him get there, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. Sarah, Marcus warned, you're talking about something that could get us all killed. And doing nothing could get him killed, she replied. Or worse, sent back to Riverside to face whatever punishment they have waiting. The voices above were very close now, close enough that they could make out individual words. Check that old root cellar while you're over there, one overseer called out. Storm might have damaged the door. Elias felt his blood turn to ice. They had perhaps minutes before discovery. Everyone against the back wall, he whispered urgently. Stay absolutely silent. They pressed themselves against the far wall of the cellar, Nora cradling Samuel protectively, while the others formed a protective barrier around them. The oil lamp had been extinguished hours ago, leaving them in complete darkness. Footsteps approached the cellar door, accompanied by the sound of debris being kicked aside. The door creaked as someone tested it, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like it might open. Door's solid, a voice said from directly above them. No damage here. Good. Mark it off the list and let's move on. Got a lot more ground to cover. The footsteps moved away, but none of them dared to breathe normally until the voices had faded into the distance. That was too close, David whispered. It's only going to get worse, Elias replied. We need to move them today before they expand the search. Move them where? Marcus asked. Elias was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. Finally, he spoke. I know someone who might help. There's a free black woman named Celeste who lives about 5 miles from here. She's helped runaways before, quietly, carefully. If anyone would know how to get Samuel to Mississippi and find a place for Nora. That's a big risk, Sarah said. For all of us. Everything we do from here is a big risk, Elias replied, but doing nothing isn't an option anymore. As they sat in the darkness of the root cellar, each of them understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer just slaves trying to survive. They had become active participants in the underground network that helped people escape bondage. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning. And in the growing light of dawn, the seeds of something larger were taking root, a quiet revolution that would spread far beyond the boundaries of Belle Reve Plantation. Above them, the overseers continued their inspection, unaware that beneath their feet the very foundation of their world was beginning to shift. By midday, word of Nora's disappearance had spread throughout the slave quarters of Belle Reve. Master Beaumont had made no secret of casting her out into the storm, and his casual cruelty had stirred something deep and dangerous among the enslaved community, a quiet anger that had been simmering for years. In the root cellar, Elias had made his decision. As soon as darkness fell, he would make the dangerous journey to Celeste's cabin, hoping the free black woman would agree to help them. But first, they needed to ensure Samuel was strong enough to travel. How are you feeling, child? Nora asked, offering Samuel small sips of water from a container Sarah had managed to bring from the quarters. Better, Samuel replied, though his voice was still weak. The pain in my arm isn't as bad. Sarah had fashioned a proper sling from strips of cloth, and the boy's fever had remained down throughout the morning, but he was still dangerously thin and weak from his days of running. Tell me about your sister, Nora said gently, knowing that hope was sometimes the best medicine. Samuel's eyes brightened slightly. Ruth is smart, smarter than me. She could read a little, learned from the master's daughter before they sold her. She always said she'd find a way for us to be free together. And now you're trying to find her, Nora observed. I promised her I would, Samuel said with a determination that seemed too old for his 12 years. The night before they took her, she made me promise that no matter what happened, I wouldn't give up on us being a family. The simple words carried the weight of countless broken families, countless promises made in the darkness of slave quarters across the South. Each person in the cellar had their own stories of separation and loss, their own dreams of reunion that seemed impossible in a world designed to keep them apart. Above ground, the plantation was returning to its normal rhythm after the storm. The field hands were clearing debris and assessing damage to the cotton crop, while the house slaves resumed their duties in the big house. But beneath the surface of routine, something was changing. In the kitchen house, where Nora had worked for so many years, the other slaves spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. The cook, a middle-aged woman named Bessie, found herself struggling to concentrate on her tasks. Ain't right, she muttered to herself as she kneaded bread dough with unusual force. Throwing an old woman out in a storm like that ain't right at all. Her words were overheard by James, a house slave who had been at Belle Reve almost as long as Nora. "Master's got the right to do what he wants with his property," he said quietly, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Property," Bessie spat. "That woman raised half the children in these quarters, tended to the sick, comforted the dying. She's got more humanity in her little finger than Master Beaumont's got in his whole body." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, the head overseer, a brutal man whose very presence could silence a room. But even he seemed affected by the previous night's events. "Any of you seen anything unusual this morning?" he asked, his eyes scanning the kitchen. "Any signs of disturbance?" "Just storm damage, sir," Bessie replied carefully. "Nothing unusual." Thomas nodded but didn't leave immediately. "Master Beaumont wants it known that anyone caught helping runaways or harboring fugitives will face severe punishment. Anyone. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," came the chorus of replies. After Thomas left, the kitchen fell silent, but the silence carried its own message, a shared understanding that lines were being drawn and each person would soon have to choose which side they were on. Meanwhile, at the neighboring riverside plantation, Master William Crenshaw was dealing with his own crisis. The discovery that young Samuel had escaped during the storm had sent him into a rage that his slaves knew all too well. $50 reward for the return of my property," he announced to his overseer, "and I want every plantation within 20 miles notified. That boy doesn't get far without help." The overseer, a man named Pike, who was known for his tracking skills, nodded grimly. "I'll get the dogs ready and start checking the usual hiding places. Storm might have slowed him down." "It better have," Crenshaw snarled. "I've got buyers coming next week, and I promised them a full inventory. I can't afford to lose property to runaways." But Pike was already thinking beyond the immediate search. A 12-year-old boy couldn't survive 3 days in the wilderness without help. Someone was assisting him, and that meant the network of sympathizers was more extensive than they had realized. Back in the root cellar, Elias was making final preparations for his nighttime journey to Celeste's cabin. The risk was enormous. If he was caught away from the plantation without a pass, the punishment would be severe. But the alternative was watching Samuel and Nora slowly die in their underground hiding place. "I should go with you," Sarah said for the third time. "No," Elias replied firmly. "If something happens to me, they'll need you here. You're the only one with medical knowledge. And if something happens to you, we'll all be trapped down here," Marcus pointed out. Elias understood their concerns, but he also knew that splitting up would only increase their chances of being caught. "Celeste knows me. She's more likely to trust one person than a group." As evening approached, they could hear the sounds of the plantation settling into its nighttime routine. The field hands were returning from their work, the house slaves were finishing their duties, and the overseers were beginning their evening patrols. "It's time," Elias said, checking to make sure the cellar door was clear. Nora reached out and grasped his hand. "Be careful, son. You're risking everything for us." "We're all risking everything," Elias replied. "But some things are worth the risk." He slipped out of the cellar and into the gathering darkness, leaving behind 4 people whose lives now depended on his success. The journey to Celeste's cabin would take him across dangerous territory, through swampland where slave catchers often waited, past plantations where the dogs were trained to attack runaways on sight. But as he made his way through the Louisiana night, Elias carried with him something more powerful than fear, the knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself, a network of courage and compassion that stretched across the South like an invisible web of hope. Behind him in the root cellar, Nora continued to tend to Samuel while Sarah and Marcus kept watch. They didn't know if Elias would return with help or if they would be discovered before dawn. But they knew that whatever happened, they had chosen to stand together against a system that sought to crush their humanity. The network was awakening, one act of courage at a time, and Belle Reve would never be the same. Elias moved through the Louisiana night like a ghost, using every skill he had learned during his years of planning his own escape. The storm had left the landscape transformed. Familiar paths were now blocked by fallen trees, and new streams had formed where none existed before, but he pressed on, guided by the North Star and his desperate need to find help for Samuel and Nora. Celeste's cabin sat on a small plot of land she had purchased, with money saved from years of taking in laundry and selling vegetables. As a free black woman in Louisiana, her position was precarious. She existed in the narrow space between slavery and true freedom, always one accusation away from losing everything she had built. When Elias finally reached her property, he found Celeste sitting on her porch despite the late hour, as if she had been expecting him. She was a woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and hands that showed the calluses of hard work. Her freedom papers were always kept close at hand, a necessity in a world where any black person could be assumed to be someone's property. "Elias," she said quietly as he approached, "I wondered if I'd see you tonight." "You heard about the storm?" he asked, surprised by her calm demeanor. "I heard about more than the storm," Celeste replied. "Word travels fast when an old woman gets thrown out to die and a boy goes missing from Riverside. Sit down, child. You look like you've been through hell." Elias collapsed onto the porch steps, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "They're hiding in an old root cellar at Belle Reve. The boy's hurt bad, and Nora, she saved his life, but she's not going to last much longer without proper care." Celeste was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly in her chair. "You know what you're asking me to do? I know it's dangerous." "Dangerous?" Celeste laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Child, if they catch me helping runaways, they won't just take my freedom. They'll make an example of me that'll scare every free black person in Louisiana." Elias felt his heart sink. He had hoped that Celeste's reputation for helping runaways meant she would agree immediately, but he was beginning to understand the complexity of her position. "But," she continued, "I also know what it means to watch people die when you could have saved them. Tell me about the boy." Elias described Samuel's condition, his escape from Riverside, and his desperate quest to find his sister in Mississippi. As he spoke, he watched Celeste's expression change from caution to something deeper, a recognition of the bonds that slavery tried to break but could never fully destroy. "And the old woman? Nora's been like a grandmother to half the slaves at Belle Reve," Elias explained. "She's the one who taught us to read, who tended to us when we were sick, who held us when we cried. Master Beaumont threw her away like she was nothing." Celeste stood up and walked to the edge of her porch, looking out into the darkness. "There's a network," she said finally. "People who help folks like Samuel get where they need to go. But it's not like the stories you might have heard. It's dangerous, slow, and most of the time it fails. But sometimes it works. Sometimes." She turned back to face him. "The boy would have to be strong enough to travel, and even then, getting him to Mississippi, that's weeks of hiding, moving only at night, trusting people you've never met with your life. He's determined to find his sister. Determination isn't always enough," Celeste said sadly. "I've seen too many people die trying to reach family members who were already dead or sold again before they could get there." The harsh reality of her words hit Elias like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't fully considered the long-term challenges Samuel would face. "What about Nora?" he asked. "That's a different problem," Celeste replied. "An old woman can't travel the underground routes. She needs a place to stay, people to care for her. And that's not easy to find." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. Finally, Celeste spoke again. "There might be a way. I know a Quaker family about 30 miles north of here. They've taken in elderly folks before, people who couldn't make the journey north but needed somewhere safe to live out their days. And Samuel, if he's strong enough, I can get him to the first station. From there." She shrugged. "It's in God's hands." Elias felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. "What do you need from us?" "Bring them here tomorrow night," Celeste said. "I'll have supplies ready and contacts arranged. But Elias, once we start this, there's no going back. For any of us, I understand." "Do you?" Celeste's eyes were serious. "Because once word gets out that Belle Reve slaves are involved in helping runaways, Master Beaumont will tear that plantation apart looking for conspirators. Everyone you care about will be at risk." The weight of responsibility settled on Elias's shoulders like a physical burden. He thought about Sarah, Marcus, David, and all the other slaves at Belle Reve who had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. "They're already at risk," he said finally. "We all are every day. At least this way, we're choosing our own danger instead of just accepting what's forced on us." Celeste nodded slowly. "That's the difference between surviving and living," she said. "All right, child, go back to your friends. Tell them to be ready tomorrow night." As Elias prepared to leave, Celeste called out to him one more time. "Elias, That old woman, Nora. What she did for that boy, protecting him with her own body, that's the kind of courage that changes the world. Don't let anyone tell you different. The journey back to Belle Reve seemed shorter, perhaps because Elias now carried hope along with his fear. But as he approached the plantation, he could see torches moving in the distance, search parties still looking for signs of the missing boy. He made it back to the root cellar just before dawn, slipping inside to find the others awake and waiting anxiously for his return. "Well," Sarah asked immediately. "She'll help," Elias said, and felt the collective sigh of relief from his companions. "But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe." As he explained Celeste's plan, he watched their faces in the dim light of the oil lamp. Fear was there, certainly, but also something else, a determination that matched his own. "So we do this tomorrow night?" Marcus asked. "We do this tomorrow night," Elias confirmed. Samuel, who had been listening quietly, spoke up for the first time. "Why are you all risking so much for me? You don't even know me." Nora reached over and took his hand. "Child, we're not doing this just for you. We're doing it because it's right. Because every time we stand up to this system, we take back a little piece of our humanity. And because," Sarah added softly, "someday it might be one of us who needs help. Someday we might be the ones running." As dawn broke over Belle Reve Plantation, 5 people sat in an underground chamber, bound together by a choice that would echo far beyond their own lives. They had decided to risk everything for the simple principle that human beings should not be treated as property, that families should not be torn apart, that dignity and compassion were worth more than safety. The network was no longer just awakening. It was alive, and it was growing stronger with each act of courage, each choice to stand together against the forces that sought to keep them apart. Tomorrow night, everything would change. But for now, they held on to each other in the darkness, drawing strength from the knowledge that they were no longer alone. The following evening arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of Belle Reve Plantation. As darkness fell, Elias made his final preparations, knowing that within hours their carefully planned escape would either succeed or end in disaster for everyone involved. In the root cellar, Samuel had grown stronger throughout the day, though he was still pale and weak from his ordeal. Nora had spent the afternoon sharing stories of her life, as if she wanted to leave something of herself behind before embarking on this uncertain journey. "I was born on this plantation," she told Samuel as Sarah checked his splint one final time. "Watched 3 generations of masters come and go. Seen children born into slavery and old folks die in chains, but I never thought I'd live to see the day when we'd fight back like this." "Are you scared?" Samuel asked. "Terrified," Nora admitted, "but also hopeful. For the first time in 73 years, I feel like I'm choosing my own path." Above ground, the plantation had settled into its evening routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. The search for Samuel had intensified, with slave catchers from 3 counties converging on the area. Master Beaumont had posted additional guards and instituted a strict curfew, but his efforts only served to highlight how much the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. In the slave quarters, word of the planned escape had spread through the careful network of whispers and meaningful glances that had always been the enslaved community's primary means of communication. Most didn't know the specific details, but they understood that something significant was happening, something that would test the bonds that held their community together. Bessie, the cook, had managed to set aside extra food throughout the day, wrapping it carefully and leaving it in predetermined locations where Elias could retrieve it. James, the house slave, had accidentally left a door unlocked and a lamp burning in the kitchen house, providing a safe route away from the quarters. Even Marcus's elderly father, who rarely spoke anymore, had pressed a small carved wooden cross into his son's hand, a blessing for the dangerous journey ahead. As midnight approached, Elias made his way to the root cellar for the last time. The weight of what they were about to attempt pressed down on him like a physical force, but he also felt something he had never experienced before, the power that came from choosing to act rather than simply endure. "It's time," he said quietly as he entered the cellar. They had rehearsed this moment throughout the day. Sarah would help Nora walk, while Elias carried Samuel. Marcus and David would serve as scouts, moving ahead to ensure their path remained clear. The journey to Celeste's cabin would take them across the most dangerous part of the plantation, open fields where they would be visible to anyone watching, and swampland where the slave catchers often waited. "Remember," Elias said as they prepared to leave, "if we're separated, everyone knows the meeting point. Don't try to be heroes. If someone gets caught, the rest keep moving." They emerged from the root cellar into a night that seemed darker than usual, as if the very sky was conspiring to help them. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the air was still and quiet, perfect conditions for their escape. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They moved slowly but steadily across the plantation, avoiding the main paths and staying close to the tree line where shadows would conceal them. Samuel, despite his injuries, proved to be remarkably resilient, gritting his teeth against the pain and refusing to slow their progress. But as they approached the boundary between Belle Rive and the neighboring property, their luck ran out. "Dogs," Marcus whispered urgently from his position as scout, "coming from the east." The sound of baying hounds carried across the night air, still distant but growing closer. Someone had discovered their escape, and the hunt was beginning. "How far to Celeste's?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. 2 miles, Elias replied, his mind racing through their options. "But we'll never make it with the dogs tracking us." "Leave me," Samuel said immediately. "I'm slowing you down. If you go without me—" "No," Nora said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone. "We started this together, and we'll finish it together." "Then we need a distraction," Marcus said. "Something to draw the dogs away from our trail." David, who had been quiet throughout the journey, suddenly spoke up. "I'll do it. Lead them off in the wrong direction. Give you time to reach Celeste's." "David, no," Sarah protested. "If they catch you, if they catch all of us, it's over for everyone," David replied. "This way, at least some of us make it." The sound of the dogs was getting closer, and they could now hear the voices of the men following them. There was no time for lengthy debates or emotional farewells. "Go," David said, already moving away from the group. "I'll lead them toward the river. Should buy you at least an hour." He disappeared into the darkness, and within minutes they could hear him crashing through the underbrush in the opposite direction from their intended route. The dogs immediately changed course, their baying growing more excited as they picked up his fresh trail. "Move," Elias said urgently, and they resumed their journey towards Celeste's cabin. The final 2 miles passed in a blur of fear and determination. Samuel's strength was failing, and Elias found himself carrying the boy more than helping him walk. Nora stumbled repeatedly, her aged body pushed far beyond its limits, but she refused to give up. When they finally saw the warm glow of light from Celeste's windows, all 4 of them nearly collapsed with relief, but their ordeal was far from over. Celeste was waiting for them, along with 2 other people, a middle-aged white man and woman whose plain clothes and serious expressions marked them as the Quaker couple she had mentioned. "Thank God," Celeste said as they approached. "We heard the dogs, thought you might not make it." "David," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "He led them away, saved us." The Quaker woman, who introduced herself as Rebecca, immediately began examining Samuel's injuries while her husband, Thomas, helped Nora to a chair by the fire. "The boy needs medical attention," Rebecca said after her examination, "but he's strong enough to travel if we're careful." "And Nora?" Elias asked. Thomas looked up from where he was checking the old woman's pulse. "She needs rest, proper food, and time to recover, but she'll survive." "What happens now?" Marcus asked. Celeste had been preparing supplies throughout the evening: food, warm clothes, and most importantly, forged papers that would allow Samuel to travel as a free black youth. "Samuel leaves tonight with Thomas and Rebecca. They'll take him to the first station on the route to Mississippi." "And Nora stays with me for now," Celeste replied. "When she's stronger, we'll move her to the Quaker settlement. She'll be safe there." As they prepared for the final separation, Nora took Samuel's hand one last time. "Find your sister, child," she said softly. "And when you do, tell her about tonight. Tell her that people she never met risked everything to help you reach her. Tell her that love is stronger than the chains they put on us." Samuel nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'll tell her, and I'll tell her about you, about how you saved my life." "We all saved each other," Nora replied. "That's what family does." As Thomas and Rebecca prepared to leave with Samuel, Elias realized that this was the moment everything changed, not just for the people in this room, but for everyone they would touch in the days and weeks to come. "What about us?" Sarah asked. voicing the question they were all thinking. "We can't go back to Belle Reve. They'll know we were involved." Celeste had been expecting this. "There's room in the network for people willing to help others escape." "It's dangerous work, but it's meaningful work. You'd be saving lives." Elias looked at his companions. Sarah, whose medical knowledge had kept Samuel alive, Marcus, whose quiet strength had sustained them all, and somewhere in the darkness, David, who had sacrificed his freedom so they could reach safety. "We're in," he said without hesitation. "All of us," Sarah added. "Count me in too," Marcus confirmed. As Samuel disappeared into the night with his Quaker escorts, beginning a journey that would either reunite him with his sister or end in tragedy, the others settled in to plan their new lives as active participants in the Underground Railroad. But the transformation that had begun that stormy night extended far beyond their small group. Back at Belle Reve, the other slaves had watched their friends disappear into the darkness, and something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of what was possible. Bessie, the cook, found herself looking at Master Beaumont's breakfast with new eyes, wondering what it would be like to cook for people who saw her as human rather than property. James, the house slave, began paying closer attention to conversations about slave prices and sales, information that could be valuable to the network. Even Master Beaumont himself sensed that something had changed. The loss of several slaves in one night was more than a financial blow. It was a crack in the foundation of his authority. For the first time in his life, he found himself wondering if his property might be planning something beyond his control. The search for David continued for 3 days before they found him, exhausted and injured, hiding in a cave near the river. But when they brought him back to Belle Reve, something in his eyes had changed. He had tasted freedom, even if only for a few days, and that taste would never leave him. Master Beaumont's punishment was swift and brutal, intended to serve as an example to the other slaves. But instead of crushing their spirits, David's courage inspired them. They had seen that escape was possible, that the system that seemed so permanent and unbreakable could be challenged. 3 weeks later, 2 more slaves disappeared from Belle Reve, then 4 from the neighboring plantation. The network that had begun with one old woman's act of compassion was spreading like wildfire across Louisiana, carried by whispered stories of successful escapes and the growing belief that freedom was worth any risk. Samuel, meanwhile, had made it safely to the second station on his journey to Mississippi. The Quaker couple had delivered him to a free black family in Arkansas who would guide him to the next safe house. His arm was healing well, and his determination to find his sister had only grown stronger with each mile traveled. Nora, recovering slowly in Celeste's cabin, spent her days sharing stories and wisdom with the steady stream of runaways who passed through. Her presence became a source of hope for people who had lost everything, proof that dignity and humanity could survive even the worst cruelty. "You know what the most beautiful thing is?" she said to Celeste one evening as they watched the sunset from the porch. "What's that?" "All those years I thought my life was ending when Master Beaumont threw me out in that storm, but it was really just beginning. For the first time in 73 years, I'm living for something bigger than just surviving." 6 months later, a letter arrived at Celeste's cabin, carried by a conductor on the Underground Railroad. It was written in careful, childish handwriting. "Dear Nora and friends, I found Ruth. She is safe and we are together in Canada. She cried when I told her about the people who helped me reach her. She says to tell you that your kindness saved 2 lives, not just one. We will never forget. Samuel and Ruth." The letter was passed from hand to hand throughout the network, copied and shared until dozens of people had read it. It became a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over safety, compassion over indifference. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurred in the slave quarters of Belle Reve itself. The plantation still operated, cotton was still picked, and Master Beaumont still ruled with an iron fist. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The slaves no longer saw themselves as helpless victims of an unchangeable system. They had witnessed ordinary people, an elderly woman, a young field hand, a cook, a house slave, transform themselves into agents of liberation. They had seen that the network of oppression could be matched by a network of resistance. Children who had grown up believing they would live and die in chains began to whisper about freedom. Adults who had accepted their fate as inevitable started making plans. The very air in the quarters seemed different, charged with possibility and hope. Master Beaumont hired more overseers, increased patrols, and instituted harsher punishments, but he couldn't stop what had been set in motion. The idea of freedom, once planted, grew like kudzu in the Louisiana soil, impossible to contain, spreading from person to person, plantation to plantation. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to slavery, many would point to great battles and famous speeches as the turning points. But those who had lived through it knew the truth, that freedom had begun in the small acts of courage performed by ordinary people on ordinary nights. It had begun with an old woman protecting a child with her own body during a storm. It had grown through the willingness of friends to risk everything for each other. And it had spread through the simple recognition that human dignity was worth more than safety, that love was stronger than fear, and that even in the darkest night, hope could light the way to freedom. The storm that had threatened to destroy Nora had instead become the catalyst for a transformation that would echo through generations. And in the end, that was perhaps the most powerful truth of all, that sometimes what seems like an ending is really just the beginning of something beautiful and unstoppable. The network lived on, carried forward by people who understood that freedom was not a destination, but a journey, and that every act of courage, no matter how small, had the power to change the world.